Well, thank you all for coming. My name's Larry Mishel. I'm the president of the Economic Policy Institute. We're here this morning for the release of the new paper by Jacob Hacker and Nate Lowenthal called Prosperity Economics, Building an Economy for All. This is, in my view, a very important paper that's going to contribute to today's discussion of economic policy, meaning this period's, but it will also be important into the future. There is finally a growing acceptance that the middle class has been very challenged, not only now, but in the past, and a challenge that has not allowed enough people to grow into the middle class. This is not a product just of the high persistent unemployment we face. It's a product of the weak recovery in the early 2000s and the failure of wages to grow, and of the period before that, the 30 years, where there was ample economic growth, but dramatic growth of inequality provided a wedge so that most people were not able to sufficiently benefit from that economic growth. This is the premise of this document, that in fact the problem has not been that we are broke or the economy is broke. The problem is that the growth did not get to most people. And the explanation for that is because of economic policies. Policies, as Jacob points out in his prior book, well, I guess it's his last book, Winner Take All Politics, is from acts of what was done, but also what was failed to be done to assist the middle class and the broader working class. Once you accept that premise, that the problem has been economic policies, then you then come to what shall we do to fix it? Because it means that the economic problems facing the vast majority is eminently fixable if you get the economics right and if you get the politics right. And in fact, that's exactly what this report does. It gets the economics right and it gets the politics right. Now, as the leader of a think tank, I obviously appreciate the fact that ideas are important. And it's important to have important thinkers like Jacob Hacker and Nate in your camp. But ideas in and of themselves don't carry the day. What carries the day is when the ideas are taken up by people that matter and organizations that matter. And that's why it's really critical that today we have leaders of many organizations that are embracing the core propositions of this report, that are effective organizations, that have organizations of the very kind of people that need to be organized to make these policies a reality here. And so I'm very proud and honored that they are all here participating in this event. The structure of today's event is as follows. First, we will have Jacob provide a summary of the key parts of the report. And then we will have brief remarks from these leaders of the organizations that I will introduce after Jacob speaks. They will join Jacob in the front and make their remarks, and then there will be time for Q&A. The biographies of all the speakers are in the packets. They're all very accomplished. They all don't need extensive introductions. I'm proud to say that EPI and me personally have had a long collaboration with everyone involved and look forward to important collaborations in the future. I should add that Rich Trumka, who will speak, is the chair of EPI's board, is my boss, and he does a great job of that. And Mary Kay Henry, president of the Service Employees Union, could not be here today, but represented by Eliseo. Medina also serves on the board. With that, let me just say briefly that we have worked with Jacob Hacker for many years, most prominently in the development and release of his report on healthcare for America in early 2007, which set the frame for the whole healthcare discussion in the 2009 and 10. And now I'm honored to say that Jacob is also a member of EPI's board. He's the right person for this job. He's a great writer, he's a great thinker, and now you'll see he's a great speaker. Thank you.
Well, Larry, thank you. And the thanks that goes to you and to EPI here is really deep. When you look at the report, you'll see a number of really attractive figures. You'll see a budget appendix that discusses why the blueprint that I've laid out will not only address our immediate and long-term economic challenges, but is also fiscally feasible. And all of that is due to the hard work of people at EPI, including Josh Bivens in particular, who's been a great help to us. There are a lot of things. I need to thank Steve Savner. I need to thank Damon Silvers, who really have spearheaded this project from the beginning. And there are a lot of others I need to thank. If you look inside the acknowledgments, you'll see a very long list, but I can't read them all. It would take up my whole time here, and I'm told that I only have about 20 minutes to speak. Whenever I'm in that position, I'm reminded of an evaluation that I received as a new assistant professor at Yale. It began very promisingly. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it in your class, because that way it would seem like an hour." So I will take up a few of my minutes to thank one very important person in this process, and that's Nate Lowenthal, who regrets he can't be here today, and really was a partner in every respect in the production of this report. I actually prevented him from coming because he makes me look too old. Actually, this picture I think is a little dated, but it's the only one I could find on Google. I want to say that when Steve and Damon came to me and said, "Do you want to write an independent report on what we need to do to restore shared prosperity?" I immediately thought that Nate would be the person to help me with that. I also remember that they said something like, "We've tried this many, many times before, and it's always been really difficult and then failed," which was exactly why I wanted to take it on. No, I should have probably taken that as a warning, but I am deeply glad that I took it on. I've been thinking about these issues for a long time. I've written on why the United States relies so heavily on private workplace benefits and why they're declining in their reach. How our political debate has grown more polarized, with the right side in particular pulling dramatically away from the rest of our political spectrum. And most recently, the ways in which rising inequality have transformed our society, but have been caused by major transformations of our politics, and Larry nicely mentioned that. I'm not going to count this as another book, but as you can see, it's vying to be one. And so I want to thank one last person. As you look at this slide on the right, picture on the right, that's my co-author, Paul Pearson. Many of the ideas in this report come from my work with him. So today I think it's fair to say that the economic debate often seems like the sound of one hand clapping. That is, there is greater assertiveness on one side about where we need to go, and on the other side, a sort of defensive crouch. The dominant discussion is around the deficit and debts, austerity. In fact, we argue that we label this dominant perspective austerity economics. I don't want to go into the details. You guys know what this view represents, but let me just give you a couple illustrations. First, this is a figure that comes from a report from the Joint Economic Committee. It looks at the distribution of the tax cuts in the most recent Ryan budget plan. This is, just to be clear, on top of the Bush tax cuts, which the Ryan plan would continue. Basically, these are massive additional tax cuts for the super rich after a generation in which we've seen, of course, a huge share of the gains of growth go to the super rich, and our tax code become much more regressive, much less progressive. And it's important to note that there is no plausible plan for paying for these tax cuts. in the Ryan budget. It relies on unspecified loopholes that can't possibly close the gap, in part because Ryan has ruled out the most important way in which we can make our tax code more progressive, namely taxing what people earn from their capital and what they earn from their labor at the same rate. The other illustration comes from a recent analysis of candidate Romney's plan. And basically, I won't summarize the slide here. The bottom line is that to pay for the tax cuts again and the increases in defense spending in this plan, we basically have to eliminate much of the rest of government. And I'm not even here mentioning the obvious point that most of the savings that are envisioned in these plans from healthcare costs come from simply shifting those costs from Medicare onto vulnerable older Americans or cutting back coverage under Medicaid. So these are striking blueprints in so many ways in terms of the priorities they represent. And what's equally striking is how much these ideas have sway today. And I think to understand that, especially when you start to look beneath the surface of the claims and see that so many of them are myths, is that the reason that these austerity economics is so dominant is because it's linked to major political changes, changes in our democracy. Our middle class has grown weaker politically, even as those at the top, especially business and Wall Street, have grown more powerful. Labor unions have lost ground, not just in the market, but in our democracy. And the result is that a series of myths have been allowed to dominate economic debate. And perhaps the greatest of these, the one that I just want to focus on briefly before outlining what prosperity economics shows, is that economic inequality is necessary for economic growth. For those who haven't read it, Ed Conard, Mitt Romney's supporter and Bain Capital, former Bain Capital executive, has a new book out. He's argued that we should be thinking doubling the share of income for the top because that would be necessary for spurring innovation and growth. Our history shows that this is false. We were more equal and had stronger growth in mid-20th century, but we don't have to look at our history. This figure is very simple. It just shows the cumulative growth in GDP per capita from 1994 to 2004, and then on one axis, and on the other axis shows the inequality at the beginning of that period. I dare you to find a relationship that isn't maybe slightly negative in this figure. And I will show one more figure about these myths that also has exactly the same message. What have austerity economics proponents demanded over the last generation above all else? Cuts in marginal tax rates for the very well off. Well, some work recently by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez shows that there is no relationship between cuts in top tax rates and economic growth. These are the two pillars of the claim that we shouldn't be concerned about inequality, or that trying to address it would destroy our economy, and both of them are false. So Nate and I took on this challenge because we wanted to show that there really isn't a conflict between fairness and growth. A tough-headed economic agenda that aims to fix the economy actually has to focus more on the middle class, more on broadening gains, more on increasing upward mobility and helping the least advantaged, more on restoring a strong bargaining power for workers, not less. We call this agenda prosperity economics. It's both practical and based on the best recent economic research and theory and our own history and the lessons of other successful nations. Now, I want to be clear, there is very little in this report, the ideas for how we reform our economy, that have not been talked about before. They've been floating around this room and other rooms like it for a long time. And in fact, they've been just part of our political discourse and proposed by presidents going back at least to Franklin Roosevelt. And not just Democratic presidents. I think that President Nixon might think this was just a little bit conservative for his taste. And I know I know that sometimes causes laughter. But look, Nixon would be called a socialist by the Tea Party today. He called for environmental protection, consumer protections, Social Security benefits that lifted millions of Americans out of poverty. go past Nixon. You know, it's harder to find things under the short-lived Ford administration, but there was the earned income tax credit. Why am I making this point? The point is that what's changed is primarily political. The bipartisan consensus that drove our politics and drove our economy has come undone. And it's come undone slowly, so that under Ronald Reagan, for example, one of the reforms we call for was considered sensible. That is, taxing capital gains and labor, income, wages at the same rate. Reagan, after all, put Social Security on a fundamentally stable path after a fierce fight, but that's because there was an underlying set of moderates and bipartisan ideals that were able to guide reform. And I'll only mention, of course, Bill Clinton in passing, but obviously Clinton showed that you can tackle deficits with a balanced approach that includes raising taxes and yet have the economy boom. So the point is simply that these ideas used to be considered common sense. And the only argument that has really been proffered against them are myths. The reason that they face difficulties today is political far more than economic. To be clear, we face grave economic challenges. Globalization. Our demography is changing in ways that will make us a stronger society if we respond appropriately. But these challenges are actually an argument for the kinds of reforms that we call for in this document, for prosperity economics. For example, global economic competition. There's no reason that it has to lead to the kind of vast inequality or huge trade deficits we've seen. These were policy choices. We need to do more to invest in people in an age of globalization and invest in productivity. This new economy is more collaborative. It's more reliant on skills. It's more dependent on strong democratic institutions in the public sector and the private sector, including labor unions, in both the high and the low end of the labor market. And while our society is indeed changing demographically, yes, we're growing older and more diverse, but both of these point in the same direction. We need to invest in young people, in working families. We need to create a base for growth so that our programs of economic security will be secure. And we need to make sure that no productive potential in our society is untapped. And we are obviously in this jobs crisis leaving a huge amount on the table. Franklin Roosevelt put it best when he said, "Economic laws are not made by nature, they are made by human beings." And this should be remembered today. These are choices we have. That's what prosperity economics says. We sum up the ideas with three pillars, what we call the three pillars of shared prosperity: growth, security, and democracy. The idea here is that our economy relies on an interaction, an interplay among both the public and private sectors and among these three fundamental priorities. I'll make a few points here and then walk through some of the various elements of prosperity economics. First, the first message here is that there is no easy easy route to growth, like tax cuts for the rich or getting rid of rules that protect against environmental risks or systemic financial risks. We have to invest in our productive capacity. That will take work, and we have to start now. That's the growth pillar. Second, you have to provide security for workers, their families, for the environment, and fiscal security, because we need to have the resources to be able to engage in the global economy. And it's precisely because our economy is more uncertain and more globalized that you need these kind of basic protections. We know the private sector will not provide them. Health insurance coverage has dropped by 10 points in the private sector in the last decade. Retirement pensions are falling apart. And since healthcare costs are the number one cause of our deficit, addressing healthcare in a serious way is the only way that we can have that resource base, while also we must restore a progressive tax base that has been devastated by round after round of unfunded tax cuts for the well-off. This is not a set of abstract ideals. This is how you do it. This is how you make prosperity. And Americans understand this. They get it. They say jobs are the number one problem. They say we should increase revenues, in part by taxing those at the top. They love Medicare and Social Security, education spending. And it's not because they think these programs are costless. They want to pay for them. They consider this: the payroll tax is the most popular tax, right? Why? Because it funds programs people believe in. They think we should cut defense spending, and they're right. They think health insurance costs too much and puts too much burden on them, and they're right. They think it's getting harder to save for retirement or get their kids through college, and they're right. So why aren't we winning these arguments? Now, I think obviously, and this brings us to the third pillar, a big part of this is an imbalance of money and power. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. After Citizens United, who can deny that with billionaires bankrolling campaigns with a revolving door that spins faster and faster, who can deny that money speaks more loudly relative to votes than it has at any point in our modern history? Who can deny when unions do not have the countervailing power in the private sector they used to, that employers, that businesses have a more free rein than ever? Who can deny that we don't have corporate watchdogs so that scandals like LIBOR can happen, that financial crises like the ones we've been through can unfold? But I think it's also worth noting that there is a profound sense of cynicism among Americans, a lack of sense that there's a true alternative to austerity economics. The progressive critiques resonate, but the public just doesn't think there's any there. And in a funny way, we're where conservatism was in the 1950s and 1960s. We're arguing about abstract values of fairness. But that's what conservatives were doing, right? William F. Buckley was standing athwart history yelling, "Stop!" And he was doing so by saying it was a violation of our liberty. Burkean conservatism was invoked, and it didn't work then. We need concrete alternatives. We need to show that government can make a positive difference in the lives of Americans. We need to take back the debate about what produces prosperities. In fact, the economic problems we face are pretty simple to understand. First, we have a jobs crisis. And that jobs crisis, while it reflects the financial crisis, could be addressed dramatically and relatively quickly if we invested substantially in things we need for the long term, like infrastructure, if we helped relieve the huge overhang of mortgage debt, and if we made sure that people who are laid off in the public sector, teachers and first responders, get back their jobs. That's what we need to do. And as bad as the crisis is for white America, I just want to note, it's far worse for African Americans and Hispanics. This is an issue of racial justice, not just economic justice. But we're not addressing it. Instead, we're talking about the deficit and debts alone, even though interest rates are near zero. And it would seem like an economic no-brainer to borrow for high-return investments that would get our economy back on track. That's the immediate problem. The broader problem is equally clear. We look back at the last decade, even the last generation. How can we say it's a stunning economic success? At least for most Americans. First, there's been an enormous gap between rising productivity and what workers earn. And no, this is not explained by rising benefits. No, this is not explained by the fact that people are somehow getting a lot of non-wage compensation, and it's not been buffeted by government. In fact, government has done less to push back against rising inequality over this period. You can see this if you look at incomes, right? This is a figure from my book. It's from the Congressional Budget Office. You can see right here, most of the growth, about a third over this period, went to the top 1%. For the middle, it wasn't wages, of course, that caused those rises. It was longer work hours. We have tapped out the American worker and put families under strain. Here's a report card. It's in the report, so I won't walk through it now. But we're not doing that well in international comparison. We may have the highest GDP per capita among large, rich democracies, but it's not buying us a healthier society. And that's clearly in part a result of the recipe of tax cuts for the wealthy and more deregulation that's being called for again today. This is a disaster. It will starve our future success. It will create greater economic imbalances. It will spill into our politics. I worry about a vicious cycle taking hold. And I deliberately printed this small enough that you cannot read the small text, but it's in the report. We need to create a virtuous cycle. We do not want unequal growth, increasing insecurity, and an unbalanced, gridlocked democracy reinforcing each other. Instead, we want shared growth. We want democracy. It's vibrant, it's strong, and we want a basic level of economic security for all Americans. So how do we do that? Well, I said I would start with the first pillar, with growth. And as I said already, we know how to create growth right now. The real question is, how do we create it for the coming decades? Well, one way we do it is exactly how we create growth now. We are, I think, around 20th, according to the World Economic Forum, in the world in terms of infrastructure. We have about a $2.2 trillion deficit, only half of which is funded, is slated to be funded in our infrastructure, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. We could put millions of Americans to work right now, and in the process, build up the kind of physical capital with returns of 15 to 45%, according to recent research, that we'll need to grow in the future. We need to tackle our trade deficit. If people think the trade deficit is just a permanent fixture, but if you look at the history, and I can show the slide later if you're interested, it's exploded over the last decade. And it does not require fancy measures to deal with this. The most important thing we can do, besides, as I'll say in a moment, investing in our manufacturing, is to get the dollar's value down. This would make an enormous difference, and this is coming from all quarters of economics. That our dollar is vastly overvalued, and it's overvalued because of specific countries trying to keep their currencies undervalued relative to ours. There are ways to fix that. We talk about that in the report. College education. A college degree is what a high school degree was a generation ago. It is the ticket, not a third ticket, as Larry has reminded me, but it is a vital part of upward mobility. So it is deeply troubling that we see results like this, where high-income kids with low test scores have the same chance, actually slightly more chance of going to college and finishing it, than do high-income kids with low-income kids with high test scores. I always knew I would mess that one up. Finally, and I can only mention this here, we have to deal with our broken immigration system. We have lots of evidence that this would be good for growth. It would also be extremely important for the low-wage labor market. Right now, we basically have a situation in which workers in the shadows and exploited are pulling down wages for those who are working in these sectors. The only way to deal with this is to have real sanctions for employers and have a broader immigration reform that deals with the reality that the millions of undocumented immigrants here need to have a path to citizenship. That is growth. Let me turn to security. It won't be a surprise, given what I've written about in the past, that I believe health and retirement security is at the center of this picture. Now, I just want to mention here two things. One is that Social Security has to be a big part of the solution to retirement insecurity. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, because it is in a world in which people's retirement security in the private sector has dramatically eroded. Social Security is really the only backstop. We used to have a three-legged stool of private pensions, private savings, and Social Security. Now, essentially, we have private savings and 401ks and the like, which are vastly inefficient, and we have Social Security. We have a two-legged stool, and you all know that a two-legged stool is not stable. We need to shore up, we need to expand and strengthen Social Security, and we can do that with sensible reforms. We also need to create a real alternative to 401ks that has the characteristics that traditional defined benefit pensions had, that is protection against key market and longevity risks, but which is does not require that employers take on these risks themselves in a global economy. And then I think it's important to understand that we need to focus on the risks facing younger Americans. This is essential to building our long-term productive capacity, investing in human capital. It's also essential to making sure that we can have high labor force participation for families, that we have continuing commitment to families that allows us to have a growing population and economy, more generally, that it creates true equality for women and men in the workforce in our society. And then we make the, I think, unconventional step of really saying that our environmental security is part and parcel of this picture. We have to think about our environment in terms of our long-term economic security. We've seen this summer with the searing heat and destroyed crops that are unquestionably caused by the slow transformation of our climate. And looking forward, we will not be able to have a strong economy unless we address climate change, unless we deal with our energy challenges, unless we invest in the kind of technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration that China, Japan, and Korea are leapfrogging us in. In other words, this is an economic imperative, not just an environmental imperative. Now, I show this figure, and I'm getting close to the end, no worries, just to give you a sense of what's happened to our tax code over the last generation. You know this story, right? We've seen it in, for example, Warren Buffett's admission that he pays lower tax rates, much lower than the people who work for them. And this is fundamental to whether or not we can address any of these issues in the future. And so we need to restore a broad progressive tax base. I talk about, with Nate, a lot of ways to do that. Let me just mention two, and then move to our last pillar of democracy. First, we have to get really serious about whether or not, about restoring a broad progressive tax base. That means repealing the Bush tax cuts for the top. It means putting in place a real estate tax. It means treating labor and capital income the same. That is, restoring the Reagan tax code of the mid-1980s. And this is often laid out as somehow foreign to free market economics. So let me just quote Adam Smith on this point. It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. And then he wrote, every tax is a person who pays it a badge, not of slavery, but of liberty. I think we can all agree that we are heirs of Smith on this issue today. Look, this agenda will not be easy to achieve, and clearly the problem is our politics. These economic ideas would work. They're grounded in a whole body of economic research and theory that we discuss. They're grounded in our history, but we've seen declining responsiveness of our political institutions to the middle class, driven by a weakening of organized labor, by the rise of corporate and Wall Street lobbies, and by the explosion, the explosion of money in politics. The Medici family had a slogan that I think sums it up well. Money to get power, power to protect money. That's really what our politics has become today. I've just mentioned, since it's kind of a pet issue of mine, that the filibuster adds immensely to this, right? And if you look at the history, and I'll just give you some numbers, in the 40 years before 1970, there were fewer than 40 cloture votes to end a filibuster. In the 40 years after that, well, there were more than 800. There were 200 such votes in the last 4 years. This is not a long-term part of our history. It is a part and parcel of this transformation of our politics that I've been talking about today. And perhaps most important, most powerful, most troubling is the efforts today to take away the most vital of our democratic resources, the franchise. We've seen a dramatic expansion of the scope of citizenship over our lifetime, over our history. But now we're going in the other way. We should absolutely say that the right to vote is a guarantee that cannot be taken away for short-term political gain. This is not just about government. We have to have democracy. We have to have checks and balances that extend beyond government. This means, for example, that we need to restore labor unions decimated by economic policies and business aggression. This figure, I think, if you put it right next to a figure, and I think Larry's done this before, of rising inequality, really shows just how fundamental the decline of labor has been over this period. I'm a political scientist. I care about labor because of its effects on the economy, but I care even more because of its effects on our democracy. You know, conservatives wrote about the little platoons that we needed to have in our society. But those platoons can't just all be conservative activists and well-heeled corporate lobbyists. We need civic groups. We need corporate watchdogs. Shareholders of the world need to unite and push back against corporate governance practices that drive up executive pay and lead to the kind of financial crises we've seen. And yes, as I said, we need unions. Unions are the folks who brought you the modern middle class. And they did that in a substantial part through their political action, through encouraging voting. There's a bunch of papers that haven't really received much attention that show that one of the key reasons for the decline of turnout in the United States is the decline of unions. We should not think of this as an economic agenda alone. It's a democratic reform agenda. That democratic reform agenda obviously has to go farther. In the report, we talk about a public financing system that would be consistent with Citizens United, though we also call for pushing back against Citizens United. We also talk about lobbying reform. And I would just say here that we often forget that corporations spend vastly more on lobbying than they do on campaign, and that on low-profile issues or issues that are very complex, that's really where the action is. You know, we have to also press for serious reform of our financial regulations, and we talk about some simple ideas in the report. Perhaps the most simple is just that we need to figure out a way to separate banking and investment. If Sandy Weil recently has said we might need to reinstate Glass-Steagall, I think it's well past time for us to really talk about how do we make sure that our economy, our government is not put at risk by casino-style gambling. One of the things that takes place in the financial sector so that we can have a stable financial system, one that supports entrepreneurs, one that supports middle-class families. I want to make a last point here, which really gets us back to the goal of shared prosperity. You know, we look across stretches of world history, and we see enormous progress. You know, if anybody has seen the TED Talk, where the guy shows how much richer and healthier most people in the world are today than they were 100 or 200 years ago, you really see that world history. This dramatic improvement in the state of our humanity was driven in substantial part by inclusive political institutions, by democracies, by democratic reform. These reforms, the institutions, the policies pursued by them, they are what creates much of our wealth today. Prosperity does not just trickle down from the top. It comes from these common sources of investment. It comes from all of us. It's a quaint term we often hear, a mixed economy. An economy in which you have a vibrant capitalism with creative destruction and a strong democracy that makes sure that people have protection against the most severe risks they face, that invests in education, that invests in infrastructure, that creates the conditions for shared prosperity. A well-functioning system of checks and balances in the private system that provides the public goods, that pushes for the public goods, and polices the private sector in a way that won't happen otherwise. It stops predation and harm, whether indirect or direct, whether through pollution or financial risks, or through the exploitation of workers. That helps translate gains in money into gains in health, gains in education, gains in social advancement. We are the wealthiest nation that the world has ever seen. We pride ourselves as a fount of innovation, even though recent research suggests that entrepreneurs are having a harder time than ever, that we have a smaller small business sector, that we have lower rates of self-employment than in other rich countries. We are not living up to the lofty vision we hold of ourselves, and we could. If prosperity economics tells us anything, it tells us that we have a choice. Thank you.
Now we have comments from the leaders of these organizations. I'm very proud to have all of them here. First, we will have Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, then Janet Murguía, President and CEO of the National Council of Raza, then Deepak Bhargava, Executive Director, Center for Community Change, followed by Eliseo Medina, Secretary Treasurer of the Service Employees Union, and last but not least, Wade Henderson, President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who will be back soon, I'm sure. And they're going to come up to the mic, and first we're going to have Rich, and then followed by Jim.
Thanks, Larry. And before I talk about any policy specifics, I really want to express how truly excited I am about this new paper, because Jacob and Nate have produced an extraordinary, and I mean extraordinary, blueprint for shared prosperity. Working people are looking for concrete policies that'll build shared prosperity. Policies with the scale and the boldness to address 30 years of an economy run by and for the 1%. Jacob and Nate have produced a document that offers real hope, founded on the real understanding of what drives successful economies in the 21st century. Prosperity economics is an integrated set of politics or policies that offers a light at the end of the long economic tunnel of a generation of stagnant wages and financial crisis. Prosperity economics offers a future worthy of America in place of the failed policies of austerity. Prosperity economics means jobs, it means investments, and it means growth. And it means economic security. And it requires that we rebuild our democracy in the workplace and in the public square. And at the center of prosperity economics is the idea that if we want a healthy economy, we really do need to reconnect wages to productivity. To do so, working people must be able to organize and bargain collectively, and to vote, and to have that vote be counted and not thwarted by the power of money or the Senate filibuster. Prosperity economics is an integrated program for long-term prosperity. And Jacob and Nate understand that to get policies that drive growth and jobs, we need at the same time to provide economic security to all. Security that allows workers and businesses to innovate and to experiment, and that in itself protects our economy from the boom and bust cycles. The market cannot provide this security on its own. When we give individuals and families a solid footing, we reinforce the foundations of a dynamic, competitive market. And this begins with some of the most talked about issues of our time: healthcare, retirement security, and taxes. We must strengthen Social Security and Medicare, not cut them. We must build on the Affordable Care Act by adding a public option with the clout to push back against insurance companies so that every American has access to affordable, quality health care. And we must finally end the Bush tax cuts for the rich, which are the single largest contributor to our current revenue shortfall, so that we can fund the job-creating investments that are crucial to our nation's future competitiveness. And Jacob and Nate's proposals for over $1.5 trillion in investments in infrastructure, new manufacturing technologies, and education over the next 6 years do just that. See, we're in the middle of an election, and this election is really about something. It's about the direction of our country. A choice between austerity policies that offer no hope for a better future, or a commitment to shared prosperity based on investing in America and restoring our democracy. And Jacob and Nate have created a program that can get the job done of restoring prosperity. We intend to share that program with policymakers, with our fellow citizens, as we get into this election, and to ask those who would seek to lead this country to get behind prosperity economics. See, we want leaders who will take us forward. We want to know that we live in a true democracy, one where money doesn't rule everything, and policies like the ones that are being proposed today, well, they get a fair and an honest debate. And I believe there's tremendous political momentum to be gained by supporting these policies. These are the values of working people. And we're asking candidates who support working families to support these policies. We'll mobilize, we'll register voters, we'll knock on doors, we'll fill the phone banks, and I promise you we will turn out the vote. This is what all American families want, and this is what all of America needs. And Jacob, I want to thank you and Nate for the great work that you've done here. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for hosting this important discussion. And congratulations to Professor Hacker and to Nate at Yale for the publication of this very visionary document. I'm the president of the National Council of La Raza, NCLR. We are the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. And I'm proud to join the AFL-CIO, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, the Center for Community Change, and SEIU for this pivotal conversation about real policy solutions for workers, families, and our economy. It is critical that Latinos are at the table when we are talking about big ideas for the future of our economy. Latinos have a proud place in the American story, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The American economy simply won't work without Latinos. Today, there are 22 million Hispanics in our labor force. By 2050, 1 in 3 American workers will be Latino. Like all Americans, Hispanic voters today say that the economy and jobs is their top concern. And it's no surprise because Latinos have been among the hardest hit by unemployment and the housing market crash. And instead of a plan to fix the crisis, the message to struggling families is one of austerity. Our country can't afford the changes we need. Parents with dreams for their children and workers who want to contribute their time and talents should not have to wait for this attention. A strong democracy, one pillar of this vision for shared prosperity, makes it possible for all Americans to affect the changes they want to see today. But there are real threats to that democracy in our country today. An anti-Latino environment that has brought pain and suffering in our community. There are those who would want to make it more difficult for individuals to exercise the most basic way to participate in our democracy, voting. We stand with our brothers and sisters in the African American community and other disenfranchised community to ensure everyone's rights are respected on the street and in the voting booth. Every politician must know that beating up on our communities has consequences. Working together, we will ensure that the American dream is alive for everyone and the voices that seek to divide our nation are finally put in check. That is why our conversation today is so important. Democracy is about moving forward together to ensure our contributions are not only stronger, but respected. Our vote matters, but elections are a means to an end, not an end itself. We cannot wait for politicians to give us the respect we deserve. We have to command it. And in the Latino community, we must use the civic engagement process, and we are. We can no longer look for others to be our champions. We can be our own champions. We saw democracy in action just a few weeks ago when California Governor Jerry Brown signed into law a bill to put an end to the unfair dual-track process that traps homeowners while they are seeking a loan modification. This victory is proof of what can be achieved when leaders from local communities, the nonprofit sector, the public sector, advocates come together to work toward common sense goals. When democracy works, solutions to our greatest challenges are possible to achieve. We have to see that kind of same engagement when it comes to reforming our immigration laws. We know that that kind of reform will bring about the growth, the prosperity, and we will use our civic engagement activities to do just that. Democracy is a key pillar to that shared prosperity. NCLR looks forward to working with our partners here today and across the country to strengthen our democracy and achieve the shared prosperity we know we can. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm Deepak Bhargava. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community Change, which works to support community organizing in low-income communities and communities of color all across the country. I want to start, too, by extending my thanks to Jacob and to Nate for this magnificent paper. This is not the first time there has been an effort to bring together community, civil rights, and labor organizations behind a common vision for the economy. It is the first time it has succeeded, and that is really no small thing. And I particularly want to lift up the role that Damon Silvers and Steve Savner played, Damon at the AFL and Steve at CCC, and doing a ton of the behind-the-scenes work that really made this possible. So thank you to both of you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a couple of the themes related to growth, one of the pillars in this paper. The crisis of 2008 really taught us that prosperity, that an economy built only on prosperity for a few is inherently unstable. And one of the key messages of this report that we think is fundamental to the articulation of an alternative to austerity economics is that this is not just a question of fairness, it is actually a question of economic efficiency. That equity and growth are not only not opposed, they actually need to go hand in hand. The depth of the crisis that we face is evident to all of us in the catastrophe of unemployment, of poverty and foreclosures that have gripped the United States. I'm just back from a few days in Ohio, and the stories that I heard in Canton would break your heart, every single person in this room, of what people are going through. And they are completely unnecessary. We face a short-term crisis in this country that is mainly a jobs crisis, not, as the out-of-touch elites in the Beltway claim, largely a deficit crisis. And we can do something about it if we have the will to do it. One of the greatest, most powerful, most pernicious aspects of austerity economics is the way in which it has made it appear that there is no alternative, that this is the air we breathe, the life we have to live. I was struck by a piece in the New York Times this Sunday which talked about the calamitous effects of 25% unemployment in Spain on households and families that are being devastated. That reality is happening all across this country in cities like Canton, in Cleveland, in Dayton, in Detroit. And it's hard not to come to the conclusion that the absence of an agenda for those places and for those people by the elites in this country is not willful, that it is an act of cowardice, it is an act of unacceptable priorities for the economy in our country. So a core aspect of this strategy that Jacob and Nate have laid out is that we can grow this economy and create millions of jobs quickly by investing in infrastructure, the green economy, care jobs to provide vital services to a growing cohort of elders, and vital public services. That by restoring those, we will solve the short-term jobs crisis and lay the tracks for long-term prosperity. So we have to be honest with each other. Our leaders in Washington are running headlong in the wrong direction. The word of the day around here is austerity, and plans like the Ryan budget would actually result in millions of jobs being lost in the country. We are challenging the conventional wisdom by arguing for broad investment in people that will lead to sustainable economic growth. I do want to mention one other thing that I think is important to highlight here. As a community leader, I want to say that I think it is absolutely critical that we restore the connection between productivity growth and wages. that is an indispensable part of this agenda, and that we ensure that workers who create the great wealth of our nation share in the fruits of that labor. And in order to do that, we have to have unions that are growing and powerful, and we have to have a system of collective bargaining that ensures that workers share in growth. So this agenda faces some obvious challenges. Most notably, the elites who run our country are increasingly remote from the lives of everyday people. They're convinced that austerity is the medicine for what ails us, and they've launched a devastating attack on workers, poor people, families, communities, and the institutions that stand for them. Increasingly, what I see in communities around the country is people are getting clear that austerity is not medicine. It is poison that is going to kill the patient. That what we need is a bold alternative. I have a confession for Jacob that I broke the embargo on this report when I was in Canton. Luckily, it was in a senior public housing development, so the risk of it making it on the front page of Politico was small. But I was struck by the extent to which there is a hunger and appetite among everyday people in this country for an alternative. They know the system is broken, they know it's rigged, they have been waiting for prosperity economics, and we're very proud to stand in support of this agenda and this report. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Eliseo Medina, and I'm the International Secretary-Treasurer of SEIU. Thank you, Larry, for hosting this event today. I am proud to join my colleagues from labor, community, and the civil rights community for the release of this very important paper on building a future for us all. SEIU represents 2.1 million working Americans throughout this country in the healthcare, public, and property services industries. Like other Americans, they have felt the impact of the economic crisis. They are working harder than ever before and falling further behind every single day. That is why SEIU believes that income inequality needs to be fully debated and addressed if we are to restore the American dream for all workers. We are painfully aware that despite its gradual recovery, our economy remains broken. While the immediate task is to reduce unemployment, we absolutely agree with the tenets of this report that much more needs to be done to reconstruct our economy. And in order to do so, that we need to empower all workers, regardless of immigration status, by protecting and strengthening the right to unite and bargain collectively with their employers. We need to regulate the financial industry to ensure that workers do not find themselves in the same situations where they spend a lifetime building their American dream by buying their homes and then seeing it endangered by the reckless conduct of some of our corporate titans. We need to rebuild infrastructure, and we need to ensure that everyone pays their fair share. We need to reinvigorate the public sector in order to maintain and protect vital services, and we need to make sure that the economy works for everyone, not just top 1%. This important paper by Professor Hacker lays out a roadmap to accomplish exactly that. Prosperity and an economic that works for everyone is a debate that is long overdue in this country. SEIU has been working to conduct a campaign for a fair economy throughout this country. And as Deepak said, wherever we go, whoever we meet, be they blue-collar, white-collar workers, whether they be Latino, African-American, or Caucasian, or API, everyone understands that we need to do something different. And as Professor Hacker's paper makes very clear, this is a matter of choice, not chance. And the way we are going to do that is by uniting and working together to bring about that change. SEIU is proud to join our partners in support of this very important contribution to that debate and to our common struggle for a fair economy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Wade Henderson, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America that's as good as its ideals. Now, first, I'd like to thank Larry and EPI for hosting this event and for the ongoing work they do in helping the rest of us understand our economy and the things we can do to make it work better for all of us. For that reason in particular, this is the perfect venue for the release of this timely and important paper. I'm also honored to share the stage with several major leaders of the civil and human rights movement. It's even better that Janet Murguía, Rich Trumka, Eliseo Medina, and Deepak Bhargava are all members of the Leadership Conference's Executive Committee, and as you've already heard, strong believers in the need for shared prosperity. And finally, thank you, Professor Hacker and Nate Lowenthal, and for your insightful and forward-looking analysis. You've not only given us a clear description of what shared prosperity is and why it's important, but you've also laid out some of the steps needed to help us achieve it. Now, the pillars of growth, security, and democracy, and the notion of inclusiveness have always been at the core of the civil rights movement. Indeed, one's civil rights cannot be divorced from issues of economic opportunity. For this reason, we believe that the pursuit of equity is the superior growth model, and that there is no greater priority for the civil rights community and the Leadership Conference than ensuring that every person in the United States partakes of the shared prosperity that defines the American dream of the 21st century. This is a worthy goal unto itself, but without it, our other priorities, like ensuring proper implementation of healthcare reform, fixing our broken immigration system, and achieving educational equity, become more difficult to advance in the policy arena and in Americans' everyday lives. It is no accident that one of the founders of the Leadership Conference in 1950 was A. Philip Randolph, the legendary founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and a leader of the March on Washington. Randolph's leadership ensured that the civil rights movement has always understood that there can be no equal opportunity for African Americans, Latinos, and other disadvantaged populations without economic justice. When large portions of our population fall behind, our entire nation suffers. Our collective prospects for the future are diminished, and the promise of America being the land of equal opportunity becomes harder to fulfill. But it's been a long time since the needs, hopes, and dreams of those at the bottom of the economic spectrum have had a prominent place in our national dialogue. Professor Hacker and Nate Lowenthal's paper provides a clear blueprint to achieve the kind of economy that enables every person to benefit from sustained long-term growth that's good for our nation, good for our community, and good for our families. Now, today's turnout tells me that we're not alone in our conviction that ensuring shared prosperity is a worthy national goal to pursue. But I also know that outside this room, there are many who will merely shrug at our efforts and dismiss our mission as an impossible quest and as an exercise in tilting at windmills. They're wrong. And speaking truthfully, our nation cannot afford for them to be right. To compete in the 21st century, we must be a nation that expands opportunity for all, promotes decent work, ensures economic security, and helps people build wealth to weather hard times and lay the foundation for the advancement of future generations. And as we've heard today, there are many concrete steps that we can and must take to begin to turn the tide on this national crisis. We can make major investments in infrastructure and public education. We can support scientific research. We can provide pathways into and through college, and we can create quality jobs right here in the United States. By restoring the key pillars of shared prosperity: dynamic, inclusive, innovation-driven growth, individual and society-wide security, and democracy that works for all of us, we can chart a new course for America's future. This is a vision of America that's worth fighting for. So let's get out there and fight for it. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great. We have some opportunities for people to ask questions or make short comments. Okay. Zanetta, are you going to walk around with the mic? Yep. Mr. Pat Malloy there is the first on the list.
Is it okay? It makes my heart very happy to see this paper and the discussion. I'm really happy that Jacob...
Say who you are first, Pat.
Oh, I'm Pat Malloy. I was a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission for 10 years and a former assistant secretary for international trade at Commerce. I'm glad that Jacob talked about the trade deficit. The original theory upon which the international trading system was based after World War II was reciprocal and mutually beneficial and balanced trade. And there were policy choices made, as you point out, that globalization proceeded with the outsourcing and outshoring of American jobs and then the import of things we used to make. Devastating impact on our cities and the working class people of this country. And whenever anybody talks about it, the same way they talk about income distribution, they say class warfare. You talk about this, they say protectionism. Rich Trumka, just a month ago, made a major speech at the Center for National Policy. And he said we should have a national goal to balance our trade within 5 years. I think we have to have those kind of goals. The American people know something is drastically wrong, and if you set some goals, it will then force us to take action to meet those goals. So I salute you in addressing this issue because it gets completely ignored in all the presidential debates. Thank you.
Why don't we take a few comments first before we let people
Yeah,
respond?
I think that's great.
Yeah. Want to let Theta there?
Theta.
Hi, Theta Scotchpole from Harvard. I'm delighted to see this discussion, and just a couple of quick comments. It seems to me that spreading the very straightforward idea through as many people and communities as we can in this country, that if we build a stronger and more secure middle class, that's the way to do economic growth. That's obvious to everybody in this room, but it's not at the tip of the tongues of millions of Americans. And it's a powerful thing when people understand that what they need economically, which is security, better wages, opportunity for their family, that that's the way to build a strong national economy. I think we have to hone in on giving people a few specifics around that so that when I walk in, as I did the other day, to buy my newspapers, and I heard one woman say to the other at the counter, all the money's going more and more to the top. And the other one says, well, maybe they're just smarter than we are. And I, of course, said, no, they're not, actually. It's not good for any of us. But that concrete thing has to be out there. The other thing I want to say is I'd like to see even more effort to grab the mantle of patriotism. Now, patriotism doesn't mean we're drawing lines against immigrants, so let me just underline that. But we should be calling out the elites in this country as unpatriotic for what they're doing. And it's an honestly true accusation. A lot of rich people and a lot of talented professionals in this country have given up on the idea of building a stronger national economy and community in this country.
Yep.
So that gives us the powerful tool of saying that we want a national greatness prosperity. We want to rebuild the nation. And so I think we should do that, and I think we should name enemies. The enemy is not money. The enemy is people who are misusing money. And it really works in politics to identify enemies. It really does.
Thank you. Okay, another, how about next theater?
Hi there, Rachel Lyons with the National Partnership for Women and Families, and I wanted to thank you so much for mentioning paid leave in the list of things. We work with everybody who's sitting on this dais on paid leave and paid sick days, and it's just great to see so many that is part of prosperity. And I guess my question is a real basic one, which is a lot of the things we want are investments. They cost money, and how we counter the continual argument that we're broke. You said it at the beginning, just as we're not, but every time we want to talk about the investments we need to create shared prosperity, we get the counter argument of we just don't have the money for it right now.
Respond to that.
How about right there?
Just Arnie Graff, co-director of the Industrial Areas Foundation. One is we need an organizing strategy. I think most of us in this room agree with what you're saying. But if we leave the room without an organizing strategy, we are going to be back here next year discussing the next paper. And that's not a critique of Dr. Hacker. It's a good it's a great paper. The second thing is, one hand clapping means the Democratic Party's walked away from us. And so we're stuck in another election where, okay, maybe we have to be for one guy because the other guy is so terrible. I don't see what the Democratic Party has done for the working person. Certainly not for unions, the right to organize, the collective bargaining. It never moves forward. And so unless we come to grips with a Democratic Party that's walked away from us, we're going to be stuck in this world of nowhere. And that's part of what the organizing strategy has to address. They're as much at fault, in my mind, as the Republican Party.
One more. Okay, well, we'll have this last person, then we'll let people respond to this.
Jan Erickson, National Organization for Women. What I'm wondering is, how can we persuade a lot of folks in the swing states to adopt prosperity for all? And is this a concept that's sellable to Tea Party members? I have real concern about how we reach these people who've become so disaffected and filled with resentment, and many of whom are suffering from the same problems that most families in Ohio and other states that have really been disadvantaged by this recession are suffering from. I think that has to be part of our organizing strategy, is to see how we can get these ideas across to those folks. It's a longer reach than talking to those people who are normally with us, but I think we have to do it.
Why don't we just proceed, go from this end, and then we'll let Jacob go first, and then other people to comment. And you're all mic'd up, so you can just
It's
sit
great.
there.
I'll be very brief because I took up a lot of time before, and I'm happy to talk afterward or communicate by email. So the first thing to say, are we broke? No. But our states and our localities are. And a lot of these debates are taking place at that level. So it's quite obvious that unless there is substantial federal help for states and localities in various ways that we talk about in the report, including one that I think is two that I think are really important going forward. Making unemployment insurance counter-cyclical so that it's automatic, so that basically the number of weeks goes up and the federal assistance goes up automatically. And second of all, increasing the federal role in Medicaid. I think essentially the Supreme Court decision has led me to believe that really over time for the working population on Medicaid, that we really should be, and families with kids, that we really should be moving towards federal financing. At the national level, we have an appendix, I'm not going to go through it, that lays out why this agenda would actually move to sustainable deficit levels within just a few years. And the obvious, and that's not our goal actually, we say we'd like to spend more because we don't think that should be the goal. The goal should be sustainable deficit levels, say, within a decade. and then long-term paying down the debt. But the reason you can do that is, first of all, it's the revenue. The revenue problem we face is just so dramatic, right? And we don't assume that it's just that the natural growth of the economy will drive up revenues. We put in place very specific revenue increasing policies that are contained in the report, and which will make the economy not only raise the revenues necessary for the investments, but also just make a lot of sense on their own. There's huge amounts of distortions. Let me just mention one: the incentives to pile corporate debt onto corporate balance sheets, which is used by private equity firms in their leverage buyouts, but which makes these firms very fragile. There's a huge amount in the offshore tax arena. The differential treatment of taxes, labor and capital income leads to all sorts of distortions. The way in which our state tax is structured leads to all sorts of distortions. So these would raise revenue, but also, as was discussed, make the economy more efficient. But the last thing I would say here is really, in addition to creating a stable, progressive revenue base, we really have to tackle healthcare costs. And I think, I put forth the idea of the public option a long time ago, and we have a lot of evidence, especially in the very low rates of growth of Medicare spending right now, that it would work. And one idea that's in this proposal that I think is really worth taking seriously is creating an enforceable budget for Medicare spending that is coupled with an absolute prohibition on reducing benefits to meet the budget. So through innovations, we could get the growth rate, I am certain, of Medicare spending, accounting for the fact that our population is aging down. But we can only do that if, even though we're already doing a lot better than the private sector, we can only do that if we have a public option that's available or we will be much more able to do it if we have a public option available for the non-elderly as well. And then the last thing I would say is that Nate and I are not message gurus. We did not poll test shared prosperity. I'm told that it doesn't test as well as some other words might. We wanted to just get the vision right. We wanted to have an agenda that would work. And we wanted to have, and we took on this task because we wanted to have an agenda that worked, that had the backing of people who could make it happen. I think there's a lot of evidence that, as Theda was saying, that being able to say in concrete, simple terms that these are things you can do to make the middle class stronger, to deal with the strains people are facing today and fear for the future, will resonate with voters. And I welcome efforts to try to come up with better language and the like. But this is really the agenda that I think needs to be pursued with that language.
Rich?
You ask if we can get everybody to understand this, and the answer is no, because many of them won't try to understand it. But here's what we've tried to do. First of all, we're here because it's a little different rollout than your normal paper. These are all the progressive groups in the country, not all of them, but a large share of the progressive groups in the country that are actually going to try to spoon feed this at the grassroots level. And let me tell you what we're doing at the AFL-CIO. Every one of our central labor councils, and there are 650 of them across the country, every one of our state feds, there are 52 of those, and you ask me how we get 52 with only 50 states. We have Puerto Rico and Guam in addition to that. So every one of them will be, one, educated on this, trained on it, and then we'll get it out. When we take this out to our members at the grassroots level, and we give it to them at the work site, when we give it to them at door knocks, when we give it to them at phone banks, it has trumped every one of the social issues out into the future, so that workers that get that dose of education, our white males outperform the non-union white males by 40, 50 points. Our seniors outperform non-union seniors by 40 points, almost 50 points. Born-again Christians, gun owners, you name it, whatever label you have, when they're able and they get exposed at the grassroots level to this, have their questions answered, and we stay in contact with them, they come back and accept us. And here's the great news, by the way. The vast majority of the American people already agree with this. These are the values that they already believe in and they want to happen. The key to us is translating, not getting majority support, but translating it into the political arena and forcing those that get elected to vote what their constituents really want them to vote and not be bought off by vast amounts of campaign money or threats or anything else. So our goal is to get out to as many grassroots people. And here's one of the only good things I can tell you about Citizens United. In the past, the labor movement, we were not allowed to talk to non-union workers. We could only talk to union workers because the law says you can't use union money to talk to anybody but union workers. Now, we can actually use some of the money that we're raising to talk to non-union workers so that when we go on a door knock, if there were 500 people or 500 houses in a small community and 100 of them were union, in the past, we could knock on 100 doors. This time, we'll be able to knock on 500 doors and answer questions for people that are out there and hopefully start to turn them around and translate what people want and believe in and what is contained in this wonderful paper into action and political capital. And so that's where we're headed on it.
Well, I do think there is an unpatriotic elite consensus that has taken hold, that is doing enormous damage, and that could give a rat's ass about people in Canton and Cleveland and Detroit and the rest of the country. That's the brutal truth of the matter. And the only thing in our history that has ever broken through that kind of consensus is a movement of everyday people who get involved and challenge power. Now, I don't think Jacob's paper, I wish this was the case, is going to be picked up by the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow and written into law anytime soon. The encouraging thing is that we've done gatherings with Jacob, with community organizers. I've tested some of these themes myself now. People are hungry. They know the system is rotten to the core. What they're hungry for, as Theda said, is what's the explanation? What are the things that we say back? What's the agenda? What is it that we rally behind? So I have great faith that this paper is actually going to be a hit in Canton, and Akron, and Cleveland, and it's our job to make a campaign of it so that it is in this election season, but really as a much longer term project. The second thing I want to say is we really will have a moment of truth as a community immediately after the election, when we will have one of the largest social policy debates ever in our country's history, with the end of the Bush tax cuts and sequestration and all this stuff that is coming upon us. And I think we can take some of the principles in Jacob's paper and apply them and make a coherent, progressive agenda for job creation, for protecting and improving rather than ripping apart Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and for making sure that we raise the revenue we need from the affluent in order to pay for it. That is an opportunity to take some of the themes that have been developed in this paper and really put them into practice in a campaign that brings different elements of our community together in a real fight at the national level. So those are a few of the steps that I think are needed from here.
So let me just say that from my point of view, we don't have a problem of not enough wealth. We have a wealth distribution problem. And in order to be able to fix that, we, from, again, my perspective is that we're not having a policy debate. This is a debate about power, and we don't have enough to be able to get what we want done. So to that extent, I agree that we need a strategy and a plan. Now, most of us here, and I think some of you that are out there, are working together on beginning to come up with a strategy on how we work together so that we're not fighting these problems in isolation. Because with all due respect to all of our institutions, none of us are strong enough to fix the problems that exist in America today by ourselves. So one of the things that we're talking about, therefore, we need to look at this as a strategy that is not an electoral cycle strategy, but it's a short-term, a mid-term, and a long-term strategy. So the short-term, I think that we have to win in November, because the alternative will be that we will spend the next 4 years in a defensive crouch rather than trying to just maintain the status quo rather than make advances for the future. So I think we need to do that, but then, right as Deepak rightfully says, the day after the election, we need to be shifting to a mode of trying to get our strategy and our agenda adopted. And we have to hold the Congress, the new president, whomever it is, accountable to do that. And in the long term, I think we need to make sure that we start to create an independent political force. Because, and it has to be a force that is based on an agenda for our community. Because as long as it is only about the charms of the candidates or the platforms of the parties, that we're never going to get to the point that we need to do what we need done. So I think it's short-term, mid-term, and long-term, but at the end of the day, it's about organization. I do think we are the majority in this country. We just are not acting like it.
Boy, do I actually have to say anything? Look, good ideas are both necessary and they can be powerful tools for social change. But even powerful ideas are not self-executing. So the truth is, this paper is a wonderful compilation and distillation of a set of policies when acted together can bring about the change we seek. But today, the politics of obstruction blatantly trumps national interest. And I'll give you two quick examples. Yesterday, the Senate failed to achieve cloture on a judicial nominee for the 10th Circuit by the name of Bhargava. He's supported by his home state senators, both of whom are Republican. He's from Oklahoma, both of whom are Republican. And he was nominated to the bench by President Obama. He failed to get the 60 votes necessary. The vote was 56 to 34, with all Democrats present voting in favor of cloture. This state has a judicial emergency, which means it does not have, the Court of Appeals, sufficient judges to handle the caseload. And yet he was blocked over this antiquated rule known as the Thurman Rule, named after Strom Thurmond, that the Senate invoked to deny President Obama additional judicial appointments until after the election. The second clear example was the debt ceiling debacle of August a year ago, when we downgraded our international credit status in favor of partisan bickering. So the truth is, we have a system that doesn't work effectively, and all of the ideas that have been outlined here have no chance of going forward if the politics of obstruction continues to rule. Some of us begin with the premise that, look, if you want change, you're going to have to make it. I quoted A. Philip Randolph earlier. He had another saying, which I will simply paraphrase, but there are no free seats, guys, at the table of life. You get what you can take. You keep what you can hold. You can't take it, and you sure can't hold it unless you're holding it. So what is the strategy? First, we need to reform the Senate rules. There are issues at play. I'm not just talking about the filibuster. There are other rules that don't rise to the sacred level of the filibuster, which should not be sacred. But there are ways of facilitating consideration of nominees and important legislation without violating the basic understanding of how the Senate functions. So reforming the rules is an essential component of change. Secondly, we're going to have to educate the public about issues of importance, and grassroots organizing is key. Obviously, this is a post-election strategy. The assumption is that we're going to be able to turn out numbers in November, between now and November. We're going to blunt the effects of voter suppression. And guys, I'm just telling you, we waited too long collectively to focus attention on this. Black and Latino groups and labor have been focusing on this for a while, but progressives are late to the party. So I'm just saying, as a general matter, we have to start looking at systemic change in the broader sense. So these are the laws of the universe as I have confronted them, but they need to change. Republicans fall in line, Democrats fall in love, and progressives multiply through division. And we've got to stop that. We got to figure out how to rearrange those rules, and let's see what we can do.
So my last few words are, we have families that are broke, we have governments that are broke, but we have an economy that is not broke. And as Woody Guthrie said, some people rob you with a gun and others with a fountain pen. It's our chance to take the fountain pen and write it so that neither families are broke and that the governments can provide what we need them to provide. And thank you all very much. Thank you, Jacob.